Hi everybody, my name is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and in this video I'm going to answer a question that I really like because it's very technical and it deals with something that I think is not always as well understood as it could or should be. So let's see, I think it says it's either pale or pole. Okay, so it looks like it's Poleepwka. I don't know. 20 euro donation, so thank you very much for that. And he says, I would appreciate your thoughts on the type of EQ and low-pass filters needed for DIY subwoofers. Because this ties into with Bass Management 101. Background, I have 4 sealed subwoofers using the Fatal 18XL 1800 drivers and 150-liter enclosures. You mentioned that these drivers are among your favorite for meeting various criteria. It is a good driver. And I've been running these without EQ, so we should fix that, or a low-pass filter. Relying on Dirac, you should not do that to handle that. However, the low-end output is lacking. I'm not surprised. Rolling off quickly after 30 hertz, even with room gain. The infrasonic performance is not as expected given the size and number of subs. Power is not an issue. The subs without low-pass filters or PEQ have output from 16.5 hertz to 2 kilohertz as measured by Dirac. And then the question is, I've noticed that most sealed commercial subwoofers limit the output above 200 hertz. For example, Perlisten spec shows 15 to 200 hertz, JTR shows 16 to 157 hertz. The JTR actually goes up to like 500 hertz. I'm not sure where the 157 might be old. So he's changed the low pass over time to different numbers, but it's not 157. Do you recommend shaping the frequency response before handling the subs over to Dirac? I do, and I'll explain why. Here's what I'm considering, and then I'm actually not going to read that, but what you're considering, I do not recommend you do that. So let's talk about what I would recommend. So first off, most subwoofers are going to include a low-pass filter, and there's a lot of reasons why it's a good idea to include something. Now, I would actually rather that companies don't make it 200 hertz if possible, only because so one of the issues is when you're trying to time align subwoofers, you need to have enough bandwidth for the technique you're using to time align it to be effective. And when the subwoofer's bandwidth is too small, 200 hertz is probably okay, but it's on the edge, which is why Jeff actually increased it to, I think it was 400 or 500 hertz, and why I kind of prefer it to be up a little higher. Or the other option would be to have the ability to turn it on and off so that when you're doing time alignment, you can widen the bandwidth temporarily. The 500 hertz is fine to fix the other issue people are trying to address. So anyway, if you look at the natural frequency response of speakers, a lot of times the bass drivers will have some peaks at the breakup modes. And when they're big drivers, like 18-inch drivers, that breakup mode can be happening in the 400, 500, 600 hertz range. And so if you don't get rid of that, what happens is you've got some distortion caused by the breakup mode, as well as a change in the response shape, and you don't want that. Now, you're not going to use it that high up, but the fact that it's there is a problem. So low passing it helps to deal with that. Low passing it also has some other advantages, but Xmax is not one of them. And I've heard some people talk about how it's needed for protection. It doesn't make any sense. You don't need to protect a driver. A subwoofer driver can perfectly handle producing 1 kilohertz without a low pass filter without any damage. You would have to be hitting that thing. I mean, that's going to be the thermal power range, but the speaker in all likelihood is going to be far exceeding Xmax long before it's ever hitting any sort of thermal limits. And once it's used in part of a bass managed system, what could you possibly be doing to to burn up the coil? So maybe I'm misunderstanding the kinds of abuse that some of you do to subwoofers, and that's why I'm not getting this. But while having a low-pass filter is a really good idea, having a low-pass filter that's that low, like 100 hertz or 200 hertz, to me is not necessary. I think you can go higher, but 200 hertz is probably fine. Like I said, 400, 500 hertz to me is a better number. You do what you want. You want to do 200 hertz, you could try it, but you should use a low-pass filter. That's issue number 1. And fourth order, you said third order. I don't know why you would do third order. Fourth order probably would be a bit better. You just want to get everything out of the realm of reproducibility quicker. Remember, even if this is way outside of the crossover point that you're using it for, you can still have problems where it's summing, like if there's a peak of any kind, that gets added into the response of the speaker it's crossed over to and creates this sound that would be audible, as well as some integration problems, as well as some added distortion. So it's just a good way of addressing that issue. Metal cone subwoofers can be especially problematic because you can get some ringing and you want to get rid of that. So the low-pass filter is something that you should use even when there's bass management systems, because it just helps to make sure that you're not creating problems for yourself. The other reason to do it is that Dirac is using an algorithm where it's trying to figure out how to use this subwoofer. And what it's doing is it's optimizing the response over the bandwidth that it creates, and then it's also creating like a confidence interval over what bandwidth it thinks is actually really, because here's the thing, a tweeter can produce 20 hertz, it just can't produce it very loud. And so one of the things they're trying to do is figure out, is it actually in the realm of its reproduction abilities, or is it just with room gain, it happens to be able to reproduce a 16 hertz tone, but it really couldn't handle it with any output. And then Dirac wants to say, or Storm or Odyssey or whatever, or Odyssey or the optimizer with Trinnov wants to say, well, I mean, yes, it has output to 60 hertz, but I don't think it has any significant output at 16 hertz, so we're going to limit it. We're not going to apply a lot of gain there. The other thing is that for very important reasons, all of those correction systems are limited in how much boost they can apply. And it's not that much, 6.9 dB, something like that. Some of them can do a little bit more. Dirac, I think, is 9. Could be wrong about that. And then the optimizer, you could do a lot more, but you shouldn't, and you could clip the output. So what you want to do is actually use the DSP in your subwoofer amplifier or an external one like a mini DSP. So if you're using an amplifier that doesn't have DSP, I do actually recommend adding something like a mini DSP. But you know, I've used Behringer amps, Crown amps. I've used RAM Audio. Actually makes a really, really good amplifier. A Speaker Power makes great amplifiers. They're not, you can't configure the DSP yourself, but if you're a OEM, you can, and then they have really powerful DSP built into them for that purpose. And so what you do with a sealed subwoofer in particular, so we'll talk about sealed versus ported for how you EQ. Sealed subwoofers are going to naturally roll off. And when you use Pro Audio drivers in relatively small sealed enclosures, because they're not really optimized for that, you often start getting roll off pretty high. It might be like 80 to 100 hertz where it starts to roll off. And you're going to get a second order roll off, but like what it means is that the anechoic minus 3 dB point might be like 50 hertz. It's really low. And then what happens when you add in room gain is you get like bass down to 30 hertz and then it falls off from there. And because remember, Dirac is trying to correct that. It's going to correct it over the range it thinks it's good, and then after that, it's not going to touch it. So you actually are going to get a more steep roll off than it should. Now you shouldn't, I see people use PEQ. That's a kludge and it's not the right way to do it. So don't use PEQ. Use a shelf filter. So what you're going to do is take a shelf filter with the right corner frequency, which depends a lot on the driver, but with something like this 18-inch driver, I think you could get away with something. You might even need 2. Normally what I do, so this is what you could do, if you can take the subwoofer outside, that's better. If you can't, you could do it in room and it's good enough to at least do this. Take the microphone and get it like 6 inches from the cone, maybe even less. It doesn't need to be loud. In fact, the microphone will overload if it's too loud. And you run a sweep from like 5 hertz to 2 kilohertz, let's say, with the microphone really close to the cone. The closer, the better. In fact, really, really close could be good. And that's going to give you a sense of the natural response. There's some corrections you do when you put the microphone right off the cone like that. So what I typically do instead of doing that is I take the subwoofer outside, put it on the ground, do a ground plane measurement, and I may not do it at a full 1 meter. I might do it at like 1.5 feet to like make sure that all the way down to really low frequencies, I'm getting pretty good accuracy. And then what you do is you apply shelf filters that help to flatten that response out. It doesn't necessarily need to be flat to 20 hertz and below anechoic. Having some natural roll-off that is not a bad thing because the room gain itself is going to bring it back up. But something kind of flat down to 20 hertz. And to do that, shelf filters are the better way to do it. So let's just say you pick 20 hertz as the corner frequency for the shelf, and you do a 6 dB per octave shelf, and you do, I mean, it could be aggressive. Some subwoofers like this, you might need like 20 dB of boost. It's not 20 dB across the board. It's going to be at that lower frequency. Now, what's going to happen is you're adding, because you're, and for those of you who think this is crazy, please understand every sealed subwoofer on the market does this. You just don't realize it. So the commercial sealed subwoofers have a ton of boost to get the bass flat. Jeff subs, the JTRs have that. Perlisten subwoofers have that. The, trying to think of it, well, the Ascendo audio speakers would have that, but like Paradigm subs have that. Poes audio subs have that. Any sealed sub is going to have this. So you're going to use these shelf filters to get the response back more flat, anechoic, or put in the kind of general wedge shape you're looking for in room. And you're going to do it pretty low. Now, the lower you do it, the more infrasonic bass you're going to get out of it. But what you really need to do is get the corner frequency down to the first mode of the room, or a little bit lower. And then the room itself will naturally flatten that out. And you don't really need to do anything below that. because you get room gain that's going to be second order. So it's going to be 12 dB per octave, and it's going to be the opposite of the natural roll-off of the sub. So that'll flatten the response out in the tone. So you only need that shell filter to go down to the first mode of the room. But you're going to run into a problem. You're going to hit a point where you're adding so much boost that at reasonable output levels, the subwoofer is going to exceed its X-Max. So this is a pretty good driver, but it still doesn't have like 30 millimeters of X-Max. So what you can do with a driver like this is you can do some testing outside to see where you start to hit distortion limits with the filters in place, and you can adjust them. If you can't do that, you can use things like those various subwoofer box simulators to look at X-Max. And then what you can do is figure out at what output level it's hitting its excursion limit. Now, I don't know what amp you're using, but if the amp has dynamic EQ capabilities, you can actually apply limiters that are dynamic limiters. It's called sideband limiting, where you step off that shelf filter at higher output so that as it gets louder, some of that boost gets brought down. Yes, it's changing the shape of the response, so it's not going to be as boosted as it was, but what it means is that in the mid-bass range, it can keep getting louder without the low bass causing you to exceed X-Max. If you can't do that, the other thing you can do is an RMS limiter or a peak limiter, and most amps have that have DSP. And those limiters can be used. The problem you're going to have is if you set that at the X-Max limit of like 5 hertz, you're going to have like no output on the sub. So you have to just pick a frequency where it's roughly where you think it's like a good kind of compromise, accepting that you can drive the sub to exceed X-Max at 5 hertz. But by doing this, what you're doing is giving Dirac different information. So yes, that driver its actual max SPL has not changed. As Mark Seaton once said, it simply it quickens the point at which the subwoofer hits its max SPL. It's the same max SPL, you're just hitting it sooner, right? So by doing that, though, Dirac now thinks the subwoofer has wider bandwidth than it thought before, and it's going to be able to do a better job with its correction. So you really don't want to let Dirac or Odyssey or the optimizer, right? You don't want to let any of those do that. In fact, when I do the Trinnov, if I am working with DIY subs with no DSP, I do sometimes do the DSP in the Trinnov, but I don't let the optimizer do this. What I do, because this is done before the optimizer runs, so before I ever run through the optimizer, when I set up the subwoofers, there's a PEQ section that's got shelf filters, and I'll pick the 6 or 12 dB shelf filter, and I'll apply whatever amount of boost I want to apply to it, and then I run the optimizer, and I've done it both ways just to see, and it's huge how because it tells you what the confidence interval is for the different frequencies. It's huge how different that becomes, even though the subwoofer's output was the same in both scenarios. And the amount of low bass extension I get in the room increases substantially. So the issue you have to be careful with the high amount of boost that I'm talking about is you just want to make sure you're not going to put yourself in a situation where you're clipping the amp or exceeding X-Max too much. But this is a very serious driver, has very serious capabilities, and so 9 to 12 dB is in all likelihood going to be more than fine, and you could probably go higher yet. So what I do when I don't have the ability to do really complex measurements outside to look at distortion rise is after I've set it up, I will do a series of sweeps at different output levels where I increase it 3 dB at a time, starting really low in frequency. I think early on you could do 5 hertz and then you could see where it goes. There's also a thing called, I think it's step in REW, where you can even set a distortion limit. It's a more accurate way to measure distortion. And I think you can even set a limit where it'll cancel doing any more if it exceeds a certain distortion. You do want to be careful not to damage the subs with these sweeps and tests, but in any case, you can do this where you go up and you kind of step up through SPL levels at different sweeps, and you can see how the bass distortion rises. You don't need to look at it and say like, oh, it's I don't know, 80%, we got to take it back. It doesn't need to be that awful to understand what's happening. You can look at it at 3 dB increments, and if the distortion level at, let's say, 80 dB is already like 10% at 20 hertz, that's kind of high. So then when you do it at, let's say, 86 dB, if it goes from 10% to like 30 or 40%, you know that you've probably got too much boost on the sub. And it really is hitting its limit on excursion, or possibly the amp is clipping with that much boost. And so you can't do that because you're losing too much output. So in that scenario, you would take your shelf filter down 3 dB. Try again. Too much still? Okay, take it down 3 dB. Or you might shift the frequency up. So now you're applying a lot less boost in the low bass where you're exceeding Xmax too much. And so maybe 20 hertz doesn't work. You try 25 hertz. That's one of the reasons why you see sealed subs with very different corner frequencies in them, is that the driver just, it would have been too much. They could have probably given you bass down to 5 hertz if you wanted it, but it would have been too compromising in the upper bass output range. So that's how I would do it. And like I said, I usually use some sort of method like the steps response measurement or just a sweep to see how distortion is rising at incrementally higher SPL levels. And by doing that, I'm able to tell, how much boost to add to make it work good. But definitely apply DSP before. Okay, ported. Ported is very, very different. You should probably not be applying any amount of boost to a ported subwoofer. The port itself is kind of doing all the work for you in that scenario. There are a couple things you do. So one of the designs you may intentionally do with a ported sub is one that creates what's called excess efficiency. So the enclosure is actually too big, basically, for the port tuning. And instead of having a flat response or even a shell down response to the tuning frequency, you have a boost. So what you would do with that is you actually do add PEQ. It's going to match the Q to the shape of the boost at the tuning frequency, and you're going to reflatten it. What you've done now is, let's just say it's 2 dB up. You've just gained 2 dB of extra headroom at that tuning point, which is great. But you want to keep that flat. You don't want to leave that in there. Now, let's just say you've got a shelved down bass response. You might flatten that back out with a shelf filter. I just said don't add boost. Now I'm going to tell you might add boost. This is a more rare situation, but you want to see how it behaves in room, because in many cases, those shelved filters, the shelving point matches a natural room gain feature in the room, where the room will, between the point where that happens and the tuning frequency, it will flatten it back out in room, and then you're just going to get normal roll off. What you're going to want to do is apply a high pass filter, probably. In residential settings with crazy over-the-top ported subwoofers, you sometimes can actually get away without having high-pass filters because there's just so much excess output and Xmax that you would never create problems for yourself. But in general, it's safer and better to apply a high-pass filter. And what you'll want to do, it depends a lot on the speaker's Xmax, but somewhere between 1/4 of an octave and 1/2 an octave below the tuning frequency, you're going to want to put in some sort of a high-pass filter. In pro audio stuff, you'll see some crazy stuff like 1/8 order. And residentially, you probably don't need to do that because you're not stressing the system as hard. I actually sometimes will do like 2nd order because it's enough to control excursion and keep it from having that high distortion rise, but it doesn't create that really, really quick. So what happens is it'll switch from 4th order to 8th order roll off because of that. And so that way you lose like all infrasonics unless you tune really, really low. So if you do a 2nd order high pass, it can provide sufficient protection, but then it doesn't necessarily cause that quick jump down. You only go to 6th order then, and you get a little bit more deeper bass, which is nice. You should never boost below tuning. That's a really bad idea. The speaker cone is losing any form of excursion control below tuning, and the Xmax skyrockets. So if you add boost, you're just increasing the point at which that happens dramatically. So never add any boost there. And like I said, Dirac and similar softwares are trying to figure out where that point is so it doesn't add any boost there. You can change the curtain. I would change the curtain in a situation like that right up to, like, if it's tuned at 20 hertz, like make the curtain at 20 hertz so that it's not applying any kind of correction below that. You really don't want to be doing that. I've seen people do that on the forums. Bad idea. Good way to add a lot of distortion and overload your subs. But otherwise, there's no real boost that's applied with ported subs. There is some hybrid designs where this isn't true. I feel like you'd have to be a pretty advanced DIYer and then probably already know this, but there's a quasi-Butterworth type approach you can do where basically you make the box too small for a port tuning. It's more commonly done today with passive radiators because it's hard to get a port tuned that low when the box is too small because the port becomes too big. But you could do it either way, doesn't matter. And then what happens is instead of getting a 4th order roll off, you actually get a early 3rd order roll off, and then it switches over eventually to more of a 4th order roll off. In a scenario like that, and the reason to do that is you get less group delay, and the response is actually more similar to that of a sealed subwoofer, but in the sound quality as well, but you still get the excursion control of a ported subwoofer. So in a scenario like that, you can apply some boost to reflatten the response. And there's been articles written over the years on like these hybrid approaches that are effectively quasi-Butterworth with EQ, where you get like a nice flat response. It behaves in many ways a lot like a sealed subwoofer, but you get the excursion control that the port would afford you. And if you do it right, like on a sub like this, if I was going to do a design like that, again, it would be kind of hard to do that because the box would have to be so small that once the port is in there at that tuning frequency, it would be like wrapping around the box multiple times. But you would tune the port really low, like somewhere between 15 and 20 hertz. And then the box, like I said, would be too small, maybe like 100. So what do you say? It was 150 liters. So you probably go like 100 liters or something. Like you'd have to model it to figure out what it needs to be. And then you would apply some boost. You would actually get a response that's more similar to the sealed one, but like that subwoofer's X-Max would be a limiting factor at that lower bass range and like at 20 hertz. And then you would be gaining like 6 to 9 dB of extra output basically by doing this without getting a lot of the other negative effects. The remaining problem, which is why I still prefer high X-Max drivers when sealed enclosures, is that port will still chuff just like any other port. And it'll still make noises that affect the sound quality. So got to deal with that. So anyway, ported subs are handled different than sealed, but in either case, there should be some DSP applied to a subwoofer before you ever let room correction should not be the way you are adjusting your response. It doesn't work. So hopefully that was helpful, and keep on watching. These donations, as I had mentioned before, are really helpful to allow me to do this. Yeah, obviously I charge for my time when you call me, and when somebody's giving something that's as specific as their situation like this, I have to be careful how I handle it. So I tried to make this a fairly general response rather than like a particular consultation type response. But the donations help to allow me to do this as freely as I can. So thank you. Follow for more.